Now, Ogyo Sorai essentially wanted to save the Tokugawa dynasty. He wanted to help the Tokugawa dynasty. He wanted to reform it. He thought it was something good that needed to be fixed. Andō Shōeki is going to react to the same problems, but in a very different way. He's going to challenge the government. And one reason he was probably willing to challenge the government was that Andō Shōeki was an educated person who lived in the countryside. He was a rural doctor and teacher. So he lived out in the country. He lived in the countryside, so he recognized the problems that were happening in the countryside. He recognized that the cities and the samurai in the cities were squeezing the countryside to make sure that the cities got their food. And even when even when the peasants were suffering, they still had to pay their taxes. They had to still pay the rice, even though they may not have any of their own to eat. Right, and that's a big problem, right? It's very frustrating if you're a farmer and your rice is taken away from you when you yourself are in danger of starving. And because he was in the countryside, he understood these people and he understood their problems. Because he was educated, he could articulate a challenge. And to give you to the government, and so he actually is going to write down a lot of ideas that we're going to discover later. He's not going to be that important at his time. He's not going to be that influential at his time, but he does show us how people are questioning the Tokugawa order. And to give you a couple examples of things he witnessed, if you've ever seen the movie Princess Mononoke, you may remember there's like a battle between human beings and giant boars, these giant hogs, basically. Something like that actually did happen. In 1749, there was a terrible famine in Japan and in the region where Andō Shōeki lived, where the boars became so hungry that they left the forests and came into the cities and attacked people, apparently hoping to eat the people. And there was these vast battles between human beings and these wild boars that he witnessed. And he's like, there really is something wrong. And he looked at the government that was taking all the rice from the farmers, and he said, this government's just a bunch of parasites. It doesn't help protect these peasants. It doesn't take care of these peasants. And what he's going to do, it's very interesting. He doesn't reject this connection between human beings and nature. He said human beings are a part of nature. We should go along with it. Right? We human beings should be a part of nature. But he interprets this nature differently. Right? Whereas the early Tokugawa thinkers argued that the social hierarchy was a part of nature, Andō Shōeki argued that the social hierarchy was a perversion of nature, that we should rather follow the most natural people, the farmers. We should live on the land and eat the food that we grow ourselves. So he's rejecting the cities. And in that way, similar to Ogyo Sorai, but he's different in that he rejects the shogunate. He rejects the Tokugawa shogun, arguing that is a world of false man-made law. Right? We shouldn't follow this man-made law. We need to go back to nature. We need to follow nature. And like I said, he's especially against non-producers, people who don't farm. So he hates the samurai and he hates Sorai. And I want to stress, this guy, his writings don't really get circulated, but what's so important about him is it shows that there is this frustration in Tokugawa society at this time. And that there is this problem of the countryside versus the cities and this questioning of the samurai and their role. Now, I stressed that Andō Shōeki is not going to be that important while he's alive. He's more important for just what he shows us about his time period. One guy who's going to be very important while he's alive and is going to continue to have importance through Japanese history is another man, Motoori Norinaga. Motoori was like Andō in some important ways. He also was a rural doctor. He lived in the countryside. He was a doctor, he was a scholar, and he was a teacher. But he's going to be a little different in his orientation. His home is near Ise Shrine, which is a very important shrine connected to the emperor because that is the shrine where the goddess Amaterasu is enshrined. And because of that, he developed a very, very strong affinity for Shinto and a very strong devotion to Amaterasu and the Japanese imperial house. And that made him very anti-Confucian and very anti-Chinese. He did not like Confucianism. He didn't like that whole system of human relationships. And he argued that those Chinese, they had what he called cunning hearts. They were not natural people. Chinese people he saw as being very cold, very calculating, as unscrupulous. And in comparison, he said that Japanese people were by nature very pure, were very good. Because, after all, the Japanese emperor is the descendant of Amaterasu, and the Japanese people are the children of that emperor. And it's kind of interesting how he does this, how he makes this argument, because the Japanese borrowed a lot of ideas about virtues from the Chinese. So, for example, the Chinese had an idea called filial piety, which is that you love and honor and respect your parents. They had ideas of righteousness, ideas of justice. And the Japanese early in their history borrowed these ideas from the Chinese. And Motoori Norinaga and looked at that, instead of saying, hey, the Chinese really helped us out, they taught us about these virtues. He says, well, actually, those Chinese, they didn't have those virtues naturally. That's why they have words for it. If you have if you just believe in these things naturally, then you don't need words for it. We Japanese people are naturally virtuous. So we didn't need to invent morality. We didn't need to have Confucius come and tell us about morality. And we didn't need to come up with words for morality because we Japanese were so naturally virtuous. We were so naturally good. In comparison, those Chinese sages, they invented morality because Chinese people lacked virtue. Right? Chinese people are unvirtuous, so they needed sages who would teach them about morality. But we Japanese people are superior because we just automatically know what morality is. We're just naturally virtuous. And one thing I should point out that Motoori would point to as a way of proving how virtuous the Japanese were in comparison to the Chinese, he would point out that in China they have many dynasties. Remember, we talked about in this class how you had this idea of, in China, that you have the mandate of heaven, and that you can lose that mandate if you misbehave, if the emperors are not virtuous. So, they had originally there was the Shang dynasty in China. They were not virtuous, so they lost the mandate of heaven, and then the Zhou dynasty came to power. They lost the mandate of heaven, then the Han dynasty came into power. The Han dynasty lost the mandate of heaven, and then the Tang dynasty come into power, and so forth and so on. And so because of that, there were many different families that ruled China. And they were virtuous for all and lost their virtue. But Motoori Norinaga would point out, look, we Japanese, we only have one dynasty. Our emperor had the mandate of heaven. He was also a descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. And because he was a descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu, he never lost that mandate of heaven. Our emperor was virtuous, is virtuous, and will be forever virtuous. And we Japanese people, too, being related to the emperor, are also like that. On the other hand, though Chinese people, they can't figure out morality. That's why they keep talking about it. That's why they keep changing emperors. Motoori Norinaga elaborated on these ideas. For example, he taught that Japanese gods had created the world, and that Amaterasu, the sun goddess, maintained the world. And that, in fact, if you looked up in the sky and you looked at the sun, you were actually looking at Amaterasu. And therefore, all people owed a debt to the Japanese gods. And he also stressed that Emperor was the descendant of Amaterasu, and that he had her heart, and that can also mean her mind, and he had passed it on to his subjects. And the Chinese had learning Confucianism had made Japanese people lose this virtuous heart and mind. So he wanted the Japanese people, to regain their true heart. And they could do this through faith in Amaterasu. Now, one thing I just want to really stress here, you can see this is very anti-Chinese. And the Japanese have a very complex relationship with China. Right? They got a lot of their religion from China as well as from Korea. Their writing came from China. Confucianism, during the Tokugawa dynasty, they were borrowing from Confucianism. And you may remember how one of the readers or documents we looked at previously had stressed how in both China and Japan, the idea of a marriage ritual was very important. And that shows that many Japanese people actually respected China. But what you can see here is an attempt by some Japanese, in this case Motoori Norinaga, to assert their own different identity. And not only arguing that they're different from China, but they're actually superior to China. So this idea that Japan should be the center of the world, not China. Now, at the time, Motoori Norinaga argued that the Tokugawa dynasty ruled by virtue of the gods. The gods wanted the Tokugawa dynasty to rule, so therefore they ruled. But remember, this is essentially dangerous because it sees it doesn't see the shogun as the center of Japan. It sees the emperor as the center of Japan and Japanese identity. So for now, Motoori Norinaga's his system, his ideas are going to support the Japanese emperor. Or I'm sorry, are going to support the shogun. But in the future, those same ideas that venerate the emperor as a living god, as the descendant of Amaterasu, is going to be used by many samurai to justify rebelling against the Tokugawa. So that's one way these ideas are dangerous. Another way these ideas are dangerous is that we'll see how it's going to lead to anti-Chinese racism that's going to lead to a lot of violence against Chinese people. Now, Motoori Norinaga's ideas are going to have an impact even at this time. This man, Aizawa Seishisai, and his ideas are described in the Huffman Reader. He's going to try and apply Motori's ideas to foreign policy. This idea that Japan is the land of the gods and therefore cannot tolerate having any foreign influence, not only Chinese but also Western influence. And he's also going to argue that the Western barbarians were going to try and spread Christianity so they could take over other countries. And so we have to also keep Christianity out. We have to resist this at all costs. And Aizawa and others, influenced by Motoori, are going to argue that Japan needs to return to an increasingly emperor-centered country. And this is going to eat away at the shogun's authority, setting up the stage for him to be overthrown in 1868.